After studying this module, you would be able to learn about the origins of ego consciousness, evaluate the limitations of ego consciousness, understand the self in Jungian psychology, and identify the differences in Jung's perspective of the self and in Vedanta psychology. When we study the psychologies that exist today and classify them according to differences in their fundamental assumptions, four major paradigms emerge. First, the reductionist paradigm, in which all complex psychological phenomena are understood in terms of something more elemental. For example, psychoanalysis and behaviorism are both reductive psychologies. Second, the humanistic paradigm, which emphasizes and values those qualities which are unique to human beings. Third, the dualistic paradigm, which interprets experience as an interaction between two complementary principles. For example, Carl Gustav Jung's psychology, writings of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, general systems theory, Sankhya philosophy. And fourth, the monistic paradigm, which considers all phenomena to be the illusory manifestation of one unified consciousness. For example, in Vedanta philosophy and psychology, especially as it is interpreted by the Advaita school established by Shankara in India in the 8th century AD. The word Advaita literally means no division or no two. Unitary consciousness is all that exists.
The origin and limitations of ego consciousness. The newborn baby has little or no sense of identity and self-definition as a distinct being, separate from his surroundings. The baby is born into a society that functions by way of the distinctions it makes. In the view of the adults who look after the infant, they are those who are good and those who are bad. There are insiders and outsiders, parents and children, and so on. The infant adopts the distinctions of those who are taking care of him or her, and she makes other distinctions such as pleasure and pain, as a result of his or her contact with the physical environment. One of the most fundamental polar distinctions made by the growing child is I or not I. The child begins to draw a boundary around what she defines as himself or herself, and thereby considers what is outside that boundary as not himself or herself, as separate, different, or alien. That aspect of the mind concerned with drawing the boundary between I and not I has been termed the ego by modern psychology. The ego enables consciousness to reflect upon itself and to give definition to itself. It also establishes self responsibility in the individual. The child in the pre-ego state cannot manage himself or herself in his or her environment because he has no clear sense of being a distinct entity. But the child gradually establishes and elaborates the duality, I or not I, and thereby creates an artificial distinction between a subject who experiences and the objects that are experienced. This construction enables the child to circumscribe a limited territory that he is able to manage. Those who do not establish a relatively clear distinction between I and not I do not become responsible members of society. There is a common belief in modern psychology that ego consciousness represents the most advanced stage in the unfolding of consciousness and is therefore the most accurate and objective perspective possible for experiencing oneself and the world. Modern psychology in this respect is expressing the self glorifying position of ego consciousness. From this position, every other form of consciousness is regarded as inferior. For when ego consciousness come into power, like certain totalitarian governments, it tries to maintain its dominant position by creating a closed one party system that suppresses the recognition of alternative means of governing the human being. Psychoanalytical psychology regards the ego as the center of consciousness. It has established the ego as the monarch of the psyche. According to psychoanalytical theory, all other structures and processes in the mature person, including the id, superego, regression, and primary process functioning, are subservient to the regulation of the ego. In the reductive model, there is no conception of a center of integration that is more comprehensive than the ego and to which the ego may itself be subservient. In contrast to this, those who take the dualistic or monistic perspective recognize inherent limitations in ego consciousness. Jung wrote, all ego consciousness is isolated because it separates and discriminates. It knows only particulars. Its essence is limited. One who identifies with the limited I, with its artificial boundaries and distinction, will inevitably experience a sense of isolation, of loneliness, and a longing for all that has been defined as outside. The ego seeks to complete itself. This I seeks out and becomes dependent on or addicted to those external objects and conditions it has artificially separated from itself. But completion and unity cannot be attained in this way because, by definition, the ego remains distinct from the object. Furthermore, however, many objects the ego acquires, these are few in comparison to all that continue to remain outside its grasp. Though the ego seeks to extend itself, it remains a limited system within the individual with a limited perspective. It is inevitably constricted by preoccupations, fears, and biases created by identifying with certain qualities and excluding others. It is inherently limited because it can experience only through others. It is inherently limited because it can experience only through the subject object mode of consciousness. The developed ego operates through formal operations, thinking, and through what psychoanalysts have called secondary processes. According to psychoanalytic theory, there is a more primitive, primary mode of functioning that disregards space and time constrictions and ordinary logic. But secondary process functioning, the functioning by which the ego operates, is bound by the constrictions of space, time, classical logic, and linear causality. This mode of functioning allows the ego to achieve a great deal, but also imposes severe restrictions on one's experiences. Formal operations functioning represent the culmination of egoistic reasoning. If consciousness is to comprehend paradox, synchronicity, and monistic conceptions, formal operations must be transcended. There must come into the foreground new modes of awareness that are not bound by the limitations of secondary process reasoning and yet are not a regression to a more primitive mode of experience. Psychoanalysis has not envisaged the possibility of a more evolved mode of cognition, but has insisted on interpreting all non-secondary process functioning as primary process functioning, a more primitive level of being. Ego consciousness is not able to reach the dualistic mode of awareness precisely because its experience is I centered or egocentric. It does not give equal weight to both sides of a polarity, including the fundamental plurality I or not I, on which it is established, and it cannot reach the monistic mode of awareness because it cannot transcend polarized thinking. Its perspective, though certainly more objective than primitive thinking, is nevertheless considerably biased. In egoistic thinking, there is a greater degree of detachment on and objectivity than in primitive thinking, but one remains in the I who is perceiving with all the inevitable attendant biases and insecurities. The ego is never as objective as it purports to be. Although ego consciousness is a necessary and very important step in the evolution of consciousness, for it establishes self consciousness and prepares the way for another more evolved mode of consciousness, the potential aroused through ego consciousness is not fulfilled until the egoistic stage is transcended. Yoga psychology offers an alternative and more comprehensive perspective for understanding human development. It recognizes and values the subject object mode of consciousness and gives the ego its due, but it does not build an entire psychology around the ego as if it were the central aspect of the human being. Through the practice of yoga, one can become aware of the limitations of ego consciousness, learn to loosen the hold of this mode of consciousness, and come in touch with the more unifying and comprehensive center of organization within. From the limited perspective of the threatened ego, such a development may result in regression, annihilation, or at the very least loss of ego's control and supremacy. Indeed, the ego eventually does come to occupy a subsidiary role, it becomes a subsystem within a larger framework. The self in Jungian psychology and in Vedanta. Carl Gustav Jung was greatly attracted to and influenced by the teachings of the East even in early childhood. He stated in his autobiography, I remember a time when I could not yet read, but pestered my mother to read aloud to me out of an old, richly illustrated children's book, which contained an account of exotic relations, especially that of the Hindus. There were illustrations of Brahmas, Vishnu, and Shiva, which I found an inexhaustible source of interest. During his formative years, Jung put aside his fascination with Eastern thought, yet he later seemed to incorporate more of an Eastern than a Western perspective in his own developing theories. When I began my career as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, I was completely ignorant of Chinese philosophy, and only later did my professional experience shows me that in my teaching I had been unconsciously following that secret way which for centuries had been the preoccupation of the best minds of the East. During a particularly trying period of his life, Jung actively practiced yoga and he studied Eastern philosophy and psychology intently. Of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, he said, "For years, ever since it was first published, the Bardo Thodol has been my constant companion, and to it I owe not only my stimulating ideas and discoveries, but also many fundamental insights." Jung believed that yoga and other meditative traditions had evolved a psychology far more advanced than the psychologies of the West. What we have to show in the way of spiritual insight and psychological technique must stem when compared with yoga backward. Jung also believed that those who grew up in Western cultures had not yet evolved enough to incorporate the wisdom of the East. The philosophy of the East, although so vastly different from the West, could be an inestimable treasure for us too. But in order to possess it, we must first earn it. Jung felt that Eastern teachings were too often misunderstood. He observed his fellow European adopting the trappings of Eastern spiritual traditions without truly appreciating the insights of those traditions. Some used yoga as physical and mental culture to suppress the unconscious rather than to bring it forward to be integrated. Others adopted the philosophy and trappings with uncritical and untested belief. Some pedantically accumulated knowledge about yoga philosophy and methods, rather applying the philosophy and methods to lead them inward towards a more unified consciousness. Jung stood at a point halfway between the psychologies of the West and the East. He acknowledged the superiority of Eastern psychology but did not believe that Westerners could really assimilate the philosophy and practices of yoga. He felt that it was necessary for the West to develop a yoga of its own, one better suited to the extraverted mind of Western men, and he regarded his own psychology as just such a development. Although Jung relied heavily on yoga philosophy and psychology in developing his own theories, he differed from the monistic viewpoint on one fundamental assumption, and as a result, his psychology remains within the dualistic framework. Jung followed a path towards self understanding that in many respects was parallel to yoga, but he stopped short, unable to reach the more encompassing perspective of monistic psychology. Yoga psychology goes on to a greater purview, leaving Jung behind to take in a more limited survey of the landscape below, albeit one that is far more encompassing than that of other modern psychologies. In contrast to the psychoanalytical tradition, in which the ego is considered to be center of integration for the personality, Jung believed that the ego is only the circumscribed center of the conscious mind and that the self is the more comprehensive center that takes into account the unconscious as well. In this respect, Jung's perspective appears similar to that of yoga psychology, for both psychologies helps to make the individual aware of the distinction between the ego and self as centers of determination, and both lead the individual away from identification with the limited perspective of the ego to become increasingly guided by the self. It should not be assumed that the self is a more comprehensive form of subjective consciousness. The self is neither subject or nor object. Subject object is a distinction created by ego consciousness and is not relevant to the self. The self is unified consciousness devoid of any such polarizations. Despite these apparent similarities, there is a striking and crucial difference between Jung's conception of the self as an archetype and the yogic conception of the self as the center of consciousness. According to yoga psychology, the ego is the center of a limited and circumscribed type of consciousness, whereas the self is the very center of consciousness that comprehends all modes of awareness. Jung, however, took the ego to be the center of all consciousness and the self to symbolize the integration of the conscious and the unconscious. He believed that the self, though comprehensive, lies beyond consciousness. According to Jung, one can never be fully conscious of the self because the self as a center of integration for the individual includes unconscious contents, and these unconscious contents can never be made fully conscious. Jung asserted that a complete emptying of the unconscious is out of the question. Consciousness, no matter how extensive it may be, must always remain the smaller circle within the greater circle of the unconscious. An island surrounded by the sea, and like the sea itself, the unconscious yields an endless and self replenishing abundance of living creatures, a wealth beyond our fathoming. Jung concluded that there is little hope of our ever being able to reach even approximate consciousness of the self, since however much we may make consciousness, there will always exist an indeterminate and indeterminable amount of unconscious material which belongs to the totality of the self. Thus, according to Jung, full self realization is an ideal never to be attained. Consequently, human suffering can never be fully eliminated. Jung believed one could only become conscious of the self partially and indirectly through the symbols it produces, to the extent that these symbols can be grasped by ego consciousness. One can make use of these treasures in achieving a more complete integration. However, to turn away from the ego and toward the self was considered by Jung to be dangerous. In fact, he went so far as to assert that it must be reckoned a psychic catastrophe when the ego is assimilated by the self. In taking this position, Jung resurrected the dualistic religious dogma that the individual can never merge with the transcendent. Throughout history, the Western mind has consistently viewed such a possibility as a threat of annihilation of the individual consciousness and has opted to remain identified with the subject object mode of consciousness, seemingly keeping the transcendent consciousness at a distance as an object. Vedanta psychology clearly disagrees with the Jung's belief that the self can never be known directly. The very aim of Vedanta is to fully experience the self, which is the center of pure consciousness. According to Vedanta, the assimilation of the ego by self, rather than being a psychic catastrophe, result in a state of illumination. In striking contrast to the dualistic position of Jung, Shankara, the most respected exponent of the non-dual philosophical position, unequivocally exerted, "You are pure consciousness, the witness of all experiences," seize this very moment to identify yourself with the ego, the doer. Its intelligence is only apparent, a reflection of the Atman, which is pure consciousness. It robs you of peace and joy in the Atman. By identifying yourself with it, you have fallen into the snare of the world, the miseries of the birth, decay, and death. The difference between Shankara non-dualism and Jung dualism is resolved when one takes into account the relative viewpoint of each position. Jung experienced the world through the waking state of ego consciousness, and from that perspective, all other modes of experience seem to be unconscious. Each night we go to sleep and pass through the cycles of dreaming and deep sleep, but most individuals do not remember much of their dream experience upon awakening, and practically no one recalls any experiences from deep sleep. So to the person who is awake, these appears to be unconscious states. In terms of the waking state, experiences from the other two states become conscious only if they can be brought over and integrated into the waking consciousness. Franklin Merrill Wolff, and contemporary of Jung who successfully followed the Vedantic path to achieve a correlation between these states, agrees with Jung to a certain degree. He acknowledges that for some the experience of this state can be a kind of regression. Some writers conceive nirvana as being like the state of the newly born infant, wherein there is little or no self consciousness. In this view, there is a part truth and a great error. Without full self consciousness, this state may be likened to a sort of original nascent consciousness, such as must precede the development of organized consciousness. It is entirely of organized consciousness to sink back into such a nascent stage. Therefore, nirvana is not the immediate goal for immature men and women. In fact, the immature entering of the state is a sort of failure. Dr. Wolff acknowledges that giving up the subject object mode of consciousness may indeed be a return to unconsciousness, but he attests that this is not inevitable. For most individuals, the center of consciousness in the septal void is a state like dreamless sleep, in other words, a psychical state that analytic psychology has called the unconscious. It is possible, however, to transfer the principle of self consciousness into the septal void, in which case it is no longer a state like dreamless sleep. This state of nirvana may be conceived of as the opposite or complement of the waking state. One who is able to remain self conscious in the spatial void experiences a state of ongoing ecstasy far in excess of any pleasure experienced through the waking mode of consciousness. Though this is a state of mystic bliss devoid of all the pain and suffering experienced in the waking state, it is not the highest state of consciousness. The most transcendent state of conscious is that which transcends all polarities, including the primary polarity between nirvana and the world of names and forms. This is a state that comprehends and encompasses the waking state and the nirvanic state along with the dreaming state of consciousness. According to the Upanishads, This is the fourth state of consciousness, the non-dual state, in which all limitations of form are transcended. It cannot be defined except perhaps by paradox of by negating any form that may be attributed to it. Jung was able to make the correlation between waking consciousness and dream consciousness, a great and rare achievement, but he was not able to correlate the state of deep sleep with the other two states of consciousness. This in a nutshell explains why and how his position differs from other psychologists and how it differs from non-dual psychology. Jung's entire life was devoted to exploring the dream state in its own right and translating his experiences into waking consciousness. This led to a great deal of struggle in certain phases of his life as he tried to maintain the correlation between the dream state and egoistic consciousness. He was more than amply rewarded for his struggle, for he explored majestic and heavenly realms whose doors remain closed to all but a few. But Jung was not able to integrate into his awareness the state of deep sleep, nor to reach that state of consciousness that comprehends both the world of form and its polar opposite, the world of nirvana. He thus was not able to experience the self directly, and as a result, he posted up as part of his psychology that the self could never be directly known.
Now let us summarize this module. Like the proponents of Vedanta psychology, Jung conceived of a universal center or self within. However, he believed that the self can never be experienced directly, that it always remains in the unconscious and can be known only through symbols. In other words, the duality that formerly existed in Western thought between man or woman and God now existed within the psyche as the duality between the ego as the seat of consciousness and the self as the comprehensive center of the psyche. Monistic psychology posits a center within each being that is a center of universal consciousness. The final phase of a person's evolutionary process consists of recognizing his or her true identity as the self or unitary consciousness. Monistic psychology describes the means for becoming aware of one's essential nature, and the practice of yoga leads towards this awakening.